My interest in the Gettysburg Address began in this building where I attended a presentation. The address was carved into the wall, and I soon wanted to know what events led up to the address, who was there, and how it was received. Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861. Here he is on February 23rd of that year. To Lincoln, the United States must have seemed incomplete. Even the Capitol Dome was under construction on his inauguration day, seen here. Looking out from the White House, Lincoln would have seen the stump of the Washington Monument as it stood during his entire term as president. The looming war was personal to Lincoln. Southerners had threatened to secede if he were elected, and his inauguration required more security than ever before. On April 12th, just 39 days after Lincoln's inauguration, the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter. While in Washington, Lincoln often attended the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, though he never joined. Lincoln would sometimes attend prayer meetings downstairs and sit outside on this settee so that he did not disturb the meetings. Lincoln's feelings about a creator would later be extemporized in the Gettysburg Address. The year 1863 was pivotal to Lincoln and to our country. At the beginning of the year, Lincoln believed that the war to save the Union could be lost. On New Year's Day, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. By year-end, the war appeared to be won. On the exact midpoint of 1863, July 1st, the Battle of Gettysburg began. 2 days later, Lee retreated toward Virginia, and on the same day, the war in the West effectively ended with the surrender of Vicksburg. Since photography at that time was based on glass plates and took a while to set up and pose, the images we have of the battle itself are paintings and lithographs. The Civil War was fought with improved weapons that were more accurate, had greater range, and systematically destroyed lines of attackers. Fired in volleys, rifle fire, and canisters of up to 20 small cannonballs tore apart military formations. Bodies were dismembered and mutilated beyond recognition. Said the Paris Figaro, "These Americans are fighting on a military system inaugurated by the Kilkenny Cats. The two armies meet and fight and slaughter each other with the utmost fury. Then they fall back and reorganize for another general massacre. Positively, the war will end when the last man is killed." This 32-foot wide painting of Pickett's charge hangs in the Pennsylvania State Museum in Harrisburg. Fascination with the Battle of Gettysburg was so enormous that cycloramas of the battle were built in Boston, New York, and Denver, and traveled as far west as Seattle. To give a sense of the scale of the troops involved, this is the central third of a panoramic photo of the 50th reunion in 1913 of the men who fought at Gettysburg. Over 50,000 veterans returned. The Battle of Gettysburg was the largest in the Civil War. About 163,000 men were involved. During the Civil War, about 600 people a day died, or about 2% of the U.S. population. Until Vietnam, more people had died in the Civil War than in all other U.S. wars combined. At Gettysburg, over 31% of the combatants were killed, wounded, or missing. This was an astoundingly horrific aspect that we tend to forget when we think about the strategies, goals, and outcomes of battles. Gettysburg, initially, was about death. The new art of photography captured incendiary images of the battle's aftermath. Pictures like this one, entitled "Incidents of War, A Harvest of Death," were widely published and caused a sensation. Photographers were authorized by the government to accompany Union troops during the campaigns. Many of their photos were first sold as prints and advertised for sale in catalogs that listed scenes of engagements or specific individuals. This was called the slaughter pen beneath Little Round Top. By nightfall on July 3rd, the remains of 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers were scattered on the battlefield. Troops dug shallow graves for mass burials, but heavy rains soon reopened the graves, and body parts were found for weeks to come. This was Little Round Top. Gettysburg at the time was a town of about 2,400 people. Wounded soldiers were crammed into every building and overwhelmed the task of burying the dead. These bodies lie in the battlefield, but many more died in the weeks after the battle. When the armies left, just 105 doctors remained to care for 21,000 wounded. 5,000 horses were also killed at Gettysburg. The stench from the rotting dead sickened townspeople for months. The Battle of Gettysburg could have ended the war. Lee retreated south and was trapped for 10 days by the flooding Potomac River. Against Lincoln's direct command, Meade held a council of war and missed his opportunity to trap Lee. In his famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie tells the story of Lincoln's disappointment. An unsent letter was found in Lincoln's papers after his death. It said in part, "My dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably because of it." The states were responsible for the aftermath of battles on their own land. Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, later appointed minister to Russia by President Ulysses S. Grant, charged Gettysburg Judge David Wills with the task of cleaning up Gettysburg. Wills quickly acquired 17 acres and hired William Saunders to design the cemetery. Saunders was a founder and first president of the National Grange, and he designed the park system in Washington, D.C., where he oversaw the planting of 80,000 trees. On September 23rd, Wills invited Edward Everett to speak on October 23rd, but Everett declined, saying he needed until November 19th to prepare such an important speech. Despite the war, the country was thriving, and Lincoln issued a Thanksgiving Day proclamation on October 3, 1863, that established Thanksgiving in this country on the last Thursday in November. Not until November 2nd did Wills invite Lincoln to speak. Wills' invitation to the president would seem almost comical today. In his letter, he lets Lincoln know up front that another speaker will deliver the main address, and he refers to the state governors as having authorized the invitation because at that time the states were responsible for burying the dead. Wills self-consciously notes that these ceremonies will doubtless be very imposing and solemnly impressive, and then he asks the president to make a few appropriate remarks. Wills could not have known that his invitation would lead to the remarkable document that we now call the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln's life in November 1863 remained complex. This is Meade's headquarters in Culpeper, Virginia. Meade was concluding his attempts to defeat Robert E. Lee after allowing the escape from Gettysburg. Meade failed to defeat Lee at Manassas Gap on July 23rd, at Bristow Station October 14th, and at Rappahannock Bridge November 7th. Farther south, Grant was preparing to attack Chattanooga on November 23rd. Union General Burnside had just withdrawn to Knoxville on November 17th, where he would successfully defend his army from Longstreet just 2 days before Lincoln would give the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln's Washington was different from what you and I have experienced. Soldiers were everywhere in and around the Capitol, defending the city and filling the tents outside the overflowing hospitals. Here you can see the unfinished Capitol building behind these New York volunteers. Here's another view of the Capitol building in 1863 with the crane still operating. The final section of the Statue of Freedom, the figure's head and shoulders, was raised onto the Capitol dome on December 2, 1863, neatly bookending that amazing year. The Soldiers' National Cemetery was not completed until March of 1864, 5 months after the ceremony, when the last Union dead were reburied. The crowd was estimated at 15,000 to 20,000, including the sitting governors of 6 states. In Gettysburg, Lincoln would have seen this Italianate gate to the nearby Evergreen Cemetery. Built in 1855, it also served as the home for the cemetery's caretaker. You can see the Evergreen Cemetery gate in the upper left. In this photo, the crowd assembles at Gettysburg on the day of dedication. Imagine trying to be heard by 15,000 people without a microphone. Difficult, but perhaps not impossible. That's 60 rows of 250 people, or 70 rows of 200. Still, if you were speaking to that large an audience, the need to project would cause you to pause for breath more frequently. This picture and the next show the crowd around the platform at Gettysburg and a detail of that picture of President Lincoln on the platform. These images were made from the original glass plate negative, the National Archives, that lay unidentified in the archives until 1952, when Josephine Cobb, chief of the Still Pictures branch, recognized Lincoln in the center of the detail. Can you find Lincoln? There he is. To his left is Lincoln's bodyguard, Ward Hill Lamon, and to the far right is Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania. Cobb estimated that the photograph was taken about noontime, just after Lincoln arrived at the site and before Edward Everett's arrival, and some 3 hours before Lincoln gave his now famous address. The entire dedication program was about 3 hours. It was delayed for a half hour while the President of the United States and other dignitaries waited for Edward Everett to appear. Try to imagine the President of the United States today waiting for another speaker to show up. After a musical introduction, Reverend T.H. Stockton, the chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives, gave the prayer. Stockton asked the nation to remember that in the freshness of their young and manly life, with such sweet memories of father and mother, brother and sister, wife and children, maiden and friends, they died for us. The Philadelphia Press remarked that there was scarcely a dry eye in all that vast assemblage. Lincoln was noticeably moved, and the paper noted that his falling tear was proof of the sincerity of his emotions. Then the Marine Band played and Edward Everett was introduced. Everett had perhaps the most remarkable resume in U.S. history. He had been a U.S. representative, senator, president of Harvard, U.S. envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to Britain, governor of Massachusetts, the U.S. Secretary of State, and the first Ph.D. in America, awarded by a Prussian university. He was regarded as the finest rhetorician of the day. Everett looked over the hushed crowd. His voice filled with emotion, he recalled the history of the setting and compared this honor of the deceased Union sons to the funerals held for heroes of ancient Greece. He gave a brief history of the battle, an account of European affairs, and his view on the eventual outcome of the war. Nearly exhausted after 2 hours of speaking, he closed by invoking the image of the Union flag flying once again over Southern capitals. Everett knew how to hold a crowd, but many people strolled around during his 2-hour talk. This single rhetorical question, taken directly from his speech, is 178 words, just 93 fewer words than Lincoln's entire address. Everett's summation gives you an idea of the flowery language of the day. His entire talk is about 13,500 words and 22 typed pages. Compare Everett's final sentence to Lincoln's talk. "But they, I am sure, will join us in saying, as we bid farewell to the dust of these martyr heroes, that wheresoever throughout the civilized world the accounts of this great warfare are read, and down to the latest period of recorded time, in the glorious annals of our common country, there will be no brighter page than that which relates the battles of Gettysburg." Next came a hymn composed by Benjamin Brown French, who had been the clerk of the House of Representatives, the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia's Masonic Temple, the president of Samuel Morse's Magnetic Telegraph Company, and at that time was Washington's Commissioner of Public Buildings. About 50 years later, French's nephew, Daniel Chester French, would receive the commission to sculpt Lincoln's image for the Lincoln Memorial. Finally, Lincoln delivered his few appropriate remarks. His speech was so brief that the photographers did not have time to capture it. While there are conflicting reports about the audience's reaction, the New York Times indicated that the address was interrupted by applause 5 times and received extended applause when Lincoln finished. There are 5 published versions of the Gettysburg Address. We are going to review the only one that Lincoln signed and the one that is inscribed on the Lincoln Memorial. I'd like to try to recreate a sense of what the New York Times reported. Lincoln is said to have spoken in a high nasally tone, and of course, he spoke without a microphone. I beg your forgiveness for my reading to follow, but I'm trying to get an idea of how one might breathe and project if, instead of hearing the address in the considered manner that it is usually read, it was shouted to an audience of 15,000 people in a field.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Everett, windy speaker though he was, had the sense to understand that Lincoln had delivered a brilliant and poetic speech. He wrote Lincoln the next day to say that he wished he had come as near the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as Lincoln had in 2 minutes. Lincoln was glad to know that his speech was not a total failure. Sarah Cook, 19 years old at the time, remembered no applause for Lincoln. William Rathbone, the only person to leave an audio account of the day, and age 9 at the time, remembered heartily applauding, but that the applause was less pronounced than that for Everett. The press divided along party lines. The Chicago Times called the Gettysburg Address dishwatery, by which they meant hackneyed. Pennsylvania Governor Curtin was impressed. John Hay, one of Lincoln's private secretaries, was 25 at Gettysburg and displayed all the brashness of a young man in a powerful circle. He referred to Lincoln affectionately as the ancient, the tycoon, the chief, or the premier. Hay noted that Mr. Everett spoke as he always does, perfectly, and the president, in a fine free way, with more grace than is his wont, said his half-dozen words of consecration, and the music wailed, and we went home through crowded and cheering streets. Hay was a young man, and he was at the center of a very large party. So why are Lincoln's 271 words so effective? His symmetry and meter empower the address. The speech is bookended by the difficult birthing process, beginning with, "Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty," and ending with, "This nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom." By the way, the words "under God" were not in his original text, but Lincoln added them extemporaneously during the address, and then incorporated them in his later revisions. Between these births, Lincoln explores dedication, using the word 6 times to describe the original dedication of the nation, the dedication of the dead, and the rededication of the living to the great task remaining before us. Again and again, Lincoln returns to dedication. His first sentence states that this nation was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And Lincoln reminds us in the very next sentence that the nation is so dedicated. He could have dropped the entire phrase and simply said, "Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation can long endure." But he underscores the birth of the nation, the dedication of its fathers, and the universal significance of the struggle by adding the phrase, "or any nation so conceived and so dedicated." This nation was born and will be reborn in freedom, Lincoln says, and we, its people, must constantly dedicate ourselves to its preservation. And that is the job of every generation. I love the way Lincoln explores that binary idea, devotion. One is usually devoted or not devoted. To be devoted is to devote oneself wholly. But Lincoln urges us to take increased devotion, and reminds us that the dedicated dead gave the last full measure of devotion. What brilliant and sensible hyperbole he hammers home with short beats. To that cause for which they gave the last full measure, and that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth. To capture the full drama of these lines, you have to speak and stress each word out loud. Lincoln's symmetrical phrases are really beautiful. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. It is for us the living rather to be dedicated. It is rather for us to be here dedicated, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion, that we here highly resolve, that this nation, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Finally, Lincoln is unflinchingly practical. He names his purpose plainly in the 3rd and 4th sentences. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. He doesn't spend any words chronicling the battle, or, as would be fashionable today, tell the emotional story of a certain soldier. Lincoln does not even point out that the battle successfully repelled an enemy. What politician before or since has missed an opportunity to alleviate the pain of the living by promoting the successes of the dead? Lincoln simply concludes, "It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this." However, he firmly focuses on that place. Where you and I would probably edit out extraneous words, Lincoln emphasizes location. He uses the word here 8 times, finishing not only by urging resolution, but by saying that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. What a great pleasure to read this elegant speech by a mystical man who helped midwife a new birth of freedom, and left this reminder that we must also dedicate ourselves to the great task of its preservation. The Gettysburg Address is inscribed in the south end of the Lincoln Memorial, which was dedicated in 1922 to honor our 16th president. Behind the 19-foot statue, the inscription reads, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." Thank you for watching.